Hey, it's Luke with Auto Darts. Nerf has released their brand new dart, the N Series. This might be the biggest change in their lineup yet. Let's get going. Hasbro was kind enough to fly myself and several other creators out to Rhode Island to visit the headquarters and check out the entire N Series, the darts, the blasters, and I'm going to go through all of that today, starting with the darts. Keep in mind, I was not paid for this video, but they did fly me out and cover all the expenses for the trip, so I wanted to get that up front from the beginning. Nerf has been known to make a lot of different ammo types. When I started the hobby, Elite had already come out, but for those that have been around longer than 2012 as a start date, the Elite Dart was really game-changing when it came out. It was the largest step forward in a universal dart that works with all blasters. The Elite Dart replaced a combination of Tagger darts, which look like this guy here, and Streamlines. I can't seem to find a Streamline dart to save my life, and I think that's because they didn't work with a lot of the blasters, so I got rid of them. Nerf also had Mega Darts, Mega XL, we had Rockets, which came a lot earlier, we had several iterations of Rival, we had the Ultra series, which you might know I didn't care for very much, and then we had the Nerf Pro half-length darts. So that's all to say that there have been a lot of ammo types, but this is a big one. This is the Nerf N1 series dart. It is a completely new design. It feels a little bit like a Nerf Ultra, but it's a little narrower. It has the same proprietary nub at the rear, just like the Ultra darts. It has a wider head than your standard Elite dart, and it's overall shorter. It's a little squishy in the middle, and the front and rear are a little more firm since there's a piece of foam sticking out the back. And then funny enough, there's a little pinhole in the back here, which when I talked to the team, they told me this was all about manufacturing. When they glue the dart in, there's some off-gassing and expansion that happens, so there needs to be a hole there to vent it. The team at Hasbro said they spent 3 years developing this dart, and they even did some crazy stuff like put this in a wind tunnel and run a bunch of simulations on it, and it is supposed to be more aerodynamic and fire farther and at a higher FPS than other darts. Now you might say, how can you fire at a higher FPS? Isn't that just firing faster? The trick there is all about toy safety and regulations. The whole N Series blaster line is 8+, which is featured pretty prominently here. It's aimed at younger kids. So this is not really your modding enthusiast blaster line. This is ultimately to replace the standard Elite blaster line. Because they're selling toys in the 8+ demographic in that market space, they actually have to adhere to a number of different rules and regulations. One is the joules, the amount of force that's actually being transferred, but because this has a larger, flatter head, it actually spreads that out so they can actually get a higher FPS with this larger dart. Additionally, the length is of great concern because when you're firing short darts, like all of us do in the hobby, you are basically firing literal choking hazards. So when we were at Hasbro, they actually showed us a choking gauge from the CPSC, which is basically how will this get stuck in someone's windpipe. And because this is longer, it passes the test and it hits that safety requirements, which for them is important to ship blasters all around the world, not just domestically here in the US. Now you might ask, but what about short darts? Well, short darts are obviously choking hazards, but they're aimed at a 14+ audience, so it has a completely different level of safety standards and regulations that apply. Beyond the choking hazards, the designers do have to work around a lot of other restraints. One of the main ones is the actual blaster noise, which in different countries is regulated, so they have to keep the blaster under a certain decibel level. Then another design constraint you'll see in a lot of blasters is the muzzle itself, where the design is deep enough that someone couldn't get a finger. Even on these 14+ blasters like this one, it's got a nice deep muzzle, so even if you had a really long finger, you couldn't get it down into those flywheels. A lot to consider when you're designing a blaster at the scale of Hasbro. We got to meet with both some of the engineers, the product designers, and marketing manager over at Hasbro, and that was a really fun experience getting to ask questions and kind of see behind the scenes. We got a really neat tour, a lot of which I can't unfortunately show you, and we got some sneak peeks at some upcoming products that I will not be showing here today that you will hear more on at a later date. Along with spending 3 years developing this dart, they went through 1,000 or so iterations on the shape and dart head to test aerodynamics, trajectory, flight, and all of this is supposedly culminated in a dart that is going to fire farther, meeting the same safety regulations and at a higher FPS. And ultimately, it will be more accurate according to their documentation. We're going to get into some extensive dart tests on these a little bit later, but I'm going to make that a completely separate video, so do hit subscribe if you aren't already. I will say, for my casual testing while at Hasbro, these do seem to fire quite straight, especially when your baseline is an elite dart. I will be interested to see in the future how they also compare with half darts. However, these are really in two different leagues ultimately when it comes to their target demographic. I found their design process to be really insightful. They actually started with essentially taking their existing blasters and modifying them and rebarreling them, much like we would in the hobby, to fire these new darts to see what kind of plunger volume you would need to fire these far enough. So they had, interestingly enough, modded chronos that were essentially the core concept, proof of concept, before going to making an entirely new blaster. They also went through a lot of product testing with kids, and that feedback from the actual kids who are play testing influences their design direction heavily. I think it's really easy for our hobby to sort of forget that these blasters aren't made for us, even though it kind of feels like sometimes they are. Without any more jabbering about this trip, let's dive into the blasters. We're gonna go from smallest to largest because that seems most obvious. This is the Ward. The Ward is a 2-shot smart AR system. So fire once, prime again, fire again. They actually developed an entirely new AR system for this, which is supposed to be more reliable and consistent from shot to shot. I'll be curious how that tests out in practice. But this is a $4.99 blaster. This is your entry line to the series. And as I'll talk about a little bit more later, I think the pricing on this whole lineup is really aggressive, which is interesting to see. Overall, I think the styling is kind of nice. It's a very basic blaster, but at $5, it's hard to complain. The grip is reasonable for my size hand. It kind of slims down at the base, but I think for most kids, this is going to be a really comfortable blaster, along with a pretty good size ring and decent mechanical advantage to prime and fire that. With the Ward, we are seeing an 85 FPS reading over 20 shots with a standard deviation of just 1. So very consistent at that FPS. Next up is the Agility. Coming in at $9.99, that seems like a deal already. This is a 6-shot revolver. It's got a nice big prime up here, which again, I think really focuses on that 8+ market so kids can actually prime it. You can, of course, prime up the top. I will note there is no slam fire on this blaster as you would expect there to be. So unlike the strong arm, you don't have that. Cylinder freely rotates. Overall, it feels pretty good. It's obviously a little small for my hands, but again, it's a blaster meant for 8+. It's meant for that younger demographic. This is a classic style blaster. I like the lines of this whole series. I think the aesthetics are very good overall. And I think it's sort of a nice upgrade from the Maverick or the strong arm. Pretty basic blaster, but you kind of got to have something if you're starting a whole new series. Performance-wise, this one was actually hitting about the highest of the whole group, nearly the highest of the whole group. We got 91 FPS with a standard deviation of 2. And again, that's a 20-shot average over our standard chronograph that we always use for all of our blaster tests. Next up is one that I really like. This is the Pinpoint. It's just got really cool, sweet, sweeping lines. It's very futuristic. I feel like it's right out of a sci-fi movie. I think some people are probably going to have a lot of fun painting these up for sci-fi props because it's just got those really long sweeping lines that I really like. It's also very fun to play with. I'm going to actually load it up, and that brings us to our first magazine-fed blaster. The Pinpoint comes with a 10-round magazine, and you'll notice that when I load these, the little nub at the bottom, the proprietary nub, actually slots right in there, and then we've got feed lips on either side, which interestingly enough can be used to dump the whole mag. So that's kind of fun. If you want to empty your mag, you can empty it real quick. But you can load these just by simply pressing them straight down. And because they've got that little nub, you can only load them one direction, making it pretty easy to figure out which direction they're actually supposed to go. Loading is pretty quick. It took me a moment when I was first starting, but I would actually say these are easier than most standard mags to load, which when you're talking about an 8+ demographic, I would actually say is a big plus. And I was surprised they didn't actually mention that as a feature. But just in figuring that out, I mean, I feel like that is kind of a good feature. There is a downside to this, and that is that once you put this in here and you have primed around, because you've got a free-floating round there, you can end up dropping that last one on the ground. So you're probably best off finishing off your whole magazine like I usually do and then moving on. But this is a bolt action blaster. It's got a jam door on the left side. It's got a built-in scope, but I don't know how practical that is, but it does look really cool. And I love this sort of skeletonized thing here. You could actually shoot your finger if you put your there, but it's pretty fun to play with. I know the blasters that my little cousins and neighbor kids go for, and it's always bigger, longer, cooler looking blasters, even if they're not necessarily the highest capacity or the highest performing. That said, the pinpoint is hitting on our tests 76 average with a standard deviation of 7, so quite a bit larger deviation there. And I would say that is more than likely due to how the breech works. The way I can see the breech loads in, there's definitely some air loss in the back there. It's not totally sealed up. There's really no barrel doing anything here, and it might be bumping in that barrel a bit, which could be causing some of the standard deviation to be higher, but overall it's still performing better than the majority of elite blasters. Well, all elite blasters, I should say. Next, I'd like to talk about the elephant that's not in the room. For some reason, they didn't send me the flywheeler, and that's my favorite. The Sprinter comes in at $29.99. You'll see me firing some B-roll here when I was at Hasbro HQ. It features a larger 16 dart magazine, which is cross-compatible with the Pinpoint. It's powered by 6 AA batteries, and no surprise, this is my favorite. It's definitely the most fun to play with. It's got kind of an interesting thumb hole, which is a little bit small for my larger hands, but it's gonna feel great in anybody who's in this age demographic. It was a really fun blaster. It's really snappy, and in the few shots I shot over the chronograph, I was hitting somewhere around mid 80s was what I was seeing for the most part, but I didn't do an official 20-shot chronograph, so it's not maybe as official as the testing we've done on these blasters. The Sprinter is the first flywheeler in the N1 series, and it is, as I mentioned, my favorite probably so far. I like playing that playstyle, getting up close to people and dumping lots of darts downrange. Speaking of lots of darts, the Infinite, like the Pinpoint, has got some kind of nice, cool space blaster vibes to it. It's almost got a Super Soaker-like feel, but ultimately this is a pump action blaster. And the most unique part about it is the magazine. This is a 40-round magazine that works kind of like a drum. It's almost like a encased drum. So you can freely rotate these to load wherever you want. You can load on the fly. You simply just drop darts in here. So this is gonna be a great scavenger build. And then the whole magazine loads just like a magazine. As I mentioned with the other blasters, this one also does not feature slam fire, though in reality, I don't know how many times I actually use slam fire. It is a fun feature and I like when it's available, but I have it on my Lynx and I have never since used it since making Lynx blasters. This has got a kind of fun mechanic. I think it's gonna be pretty neat to load in this method. It's nice being able to scavenge and just so easily pop new darts. When this is outside of the blaster, you can move it around freely, but once it's in the blaster, it's locked in place by the actual ram itself. An interesting note on the ram, this is actually a fully sealed breech system, so it's a lot more like our modded blasters in the hobby. You can see the ram will move into place and seal off with an O-ring up front, which is a departure. Most Nerf blasters don't have O-rings to actually seal up, so this should have a pretty darn good air seal. And with that in mind, we did see the highest FPS ratings out of this blaster. This blaster got us 92 feet per second with a standard deviation of 3. Definitely a good scavenger blaster. It feels good in the hand, and because there's no giant drum sticking out here, you don't do that thing where your elbow has to chicken arm out just to get around the drum. Taking some random shots across the warehouse, and they're definitely flying farther than a standard elite dart, so that's good to see. In addition to the 5 blasters available at the start, I believe there are also going to be some multi-packs you'll see out there in different combos, slightly reshelled versions of different various springers, so there are going to be some kind of different options out there. They'll also have darts available. This is a 100-pack that they sent me. I'm not entirely sure about the other quantities. This is the only one I know of so far. I know a lot of you that are into the modding or the Nerf community are really going to be wondering about, like, what are we going to do with these as far as modding potential and all of that. I'd like to dive into that in another video, but for now, just kind of want to give my general thoughts. I think it's a very bold move to a completely new dart, and it probably also felt that way when they did the 2012 Elite Dart. So Time will tell us how successful this is and how popular these are over time. I do think having a superior dart on the shelf is compelling. Elite darts have definitely become a little bit of a joke to the community at this point because even Hasbro has better darts than this. You know, their AccuStrike darts are actually very accurate and shoot very straight. Their short darts shoot very straight and work very well also. So it's interesting to see them kind of take this to the next level. I look forward to seeing what they do next with the line and how much traction this picks up. I'm definitely going to try playing with these at some games, but since a lot of our games don't have a lot of these darts yet, it'll be pretty limited use, I think, so far. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both the new blasters and the new darts. Again, this is quite a departure and it's quite a big move to move basically all. My understanding is that N1 is going to be the primary series with these darts kind of going forward. And I definitely like these a lot more than I like the Ultra darts, and that's mostly because the blasters just work and perform better. The Ultra performance was all over the map, and I was very vocal about how much I did not care for them, but these definitely seem to be a better dart overall as far as execution. Now, compatibility and what kind of blasters they'll come up with, that'll all be kind of future, but the first lineup looks pretty decent to me. Thank you again for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, and until next time, I'm out of darts.